A couple of announcements, if I could. Again, I welcome you out with the Minnesota weather that we haven't had much of this year. I know that we have at least one World War II veteran here. Bob Mickelson, are there any others? Bob Mickelson, stand up, please. Welcome, Bob. I want to tell a story on Bob. Bob was a B-29 gunner, shot down on your 9th mission, POW, for about 5 months. Wasn't exactly treated well by the Japanese during that time. He's been a great friend of the Round Table. And I recently received, Bob's getting close to 100, I think, right? Pretty close, 98, 99. But he gets out every day and he does woodwork. He doesn't sell the woodwork. He donates the woodwork and asks people to make donations to our round table. Isn't that great? Besides Bob, are there any other World War II veterans that we can recognize? Well, thank you for coming tonight, Bob. I hope that all of you will pick up the round tablet in the rotunda. The thing that I would like to have you pay attention to, besides the great writing that Connie and Chris and Joe put together, it's got some great announcements. If any of you want to overdose, there's some World War II forums, there's some other Civil War history, but anyway, there's a lot of things there, and I'm going to be adding another one. Our speaker this evening runs something, it's a corrupt thing. It's called History Happy Hour. They sit around and have a cocktail while they, yeah, that's a good thing, huh? But Rick BEYER is going to talk about that more. But that's on Sunday afternoons at 3. That's not in your schedule. He's going to talk about it, and if you need any reference, next month's round tablet, it will have that. It's actually History Roundtable. Well, anyway, he'll tell you about it. I wanted to make the announcement. We had to change the second program in March. It's correct in the round tablet. It's the naval history, the naval strategy in the Pacific, and we have a historian from the Naval Academy coming up to speak. Next month's program is Women's History. I hope that you will pay attention to this. We actually have the book. The lady has written a book, The Girls That Stepped Out of Line. It's a collection of women that made significant contributions in World War II. And she was the Deputy Chief of Army Reserve as a 1-star, retired as a 2-star general. And of course, with her talking about one of the significant people in her book is from Minnesota, but you'll enjoy that. And of course, we have our own Peggy Schulberg that's going to talk about her mother's story that many of you have already been exposed to. I want to. We're getting to a point where we need to finalize our tour, the Roundtable tour to Europe this coming April, May. We've passed out about 100 of the brochures. We've got a significant, but we've still got some openings. And I want, if you're interested in going, we've got brochures by the round tablet, and see me if you have questions. Again, it's going to have several focuses, and those were built around programs we've had this year. Flying into Amsterdam, we're going to spend a day at the 101st Airborne battle sites in Market Garden, a day at the 82nd, including Groesbeek, the river crossing. Then we're going to go up to Arnhem and see where the British came down and where they, the famous Bridge Too Far. We'll be spending 3 nights in Nijmegen, which is a wonderful city. We'll then be traveling down, stopping in Cologne at the cathedral, and headed down to Remagen. We'll be doing the Remagen Bridge crossing, and there's a new book coming out on Remagen that we'll be featuring in a year or two. We're then going to head east, going into the Weimar area. I think we're spending 4 nights there. The brochure is detailed, but we're going to visit Ohrdruf, which is the first concentration camp that the Americans encountered, and is famous for, it was actually, we actually had a veteran here, Levitt Anderson, who was part of that 4th Armored Division unit that encountered Ohrdruf. But it's a famous story where Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton inspected it. But we're going to visit that. We're going to also go to Buchenwald, which is notorious, and then into Nordhausen, which is where the Germans were building their V-1, V-2 rockets. They don't let you go too far into the mountain, but the last time I was there, you walk in and, you know, there's remains that they've scattered around so you get the feel of what the Germans were doing there at that time. Then we're going into Berlin, going to the Olympic Village, the Olympic Stadium for the 36 Olympics, out to Potsdam. And it's a great tour, a great price, and I promise you that you'll enjoy it. As I approach my 86th year, I'm trying to work my way out of a job. All I do is plan the programs, but we're getting some young blood in here. And one of the young blue bloods is a gentleman by the name of Mark Wiens, Colonel. He fought in the first Gulf War. He's a tanker. And go Army. Mark, take over.
Go Army. And we appreciate Navy for the support. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Chris. And I also like, besides Bob, thank you again for your service, Bob. I'd like to recognize a couple of distinguished guests here with us tonight. The Director of the Minnesota Historical Society, Director Kent Whitworth. Thank you for your support and being with us tonight. So let's give him a round of applause. And my general, my commanding general, Red Bull 6, and also the former Adjutant General of the state of Minnesota, General Rick Nash, is here with us tonight. Thank you, sir. Thanks for being here. Okay, so we've got a great show tonight. First thing is, I need you to silence your phones, turn them off, whatever you do, unless you're part of the Ghost Army and you're trying to intrigue us that you actually have someone giving you a live call. Okay, so who doesn't like an old-fashioned story where the good guys win, the bad guys lose at the end of the day, and we have a great rattling story to tell? And that's what we have tonight. It's the magic show. So we're under the tent. We have a great magician that's going to tell us a story. I heard that he's a singer and songwriter. I can't find any songs that he's actually written or sang, but maybe tonight he will for you. From my perspective, the first time I was introduced to the concept in a military sense of deception was in Sunday school. Does anybody remember, this is from the Old Testament, Judges 6, where Gideon is told to take 300 Israelites and defeat the Midian army with only torches and trumpets? Anybody remember that? Okay, show of hands. Okay, maybe. So go back to Sunday school, ask your teachers about that. But that was the first time I was in, and I was intrigued. What? There's no swords. There's no chariots. You're not, slaying them. They slayed themselves with this trickery. Now, my first example of actually having played the role of someone that would do deception was at high school with Mr. Lindeman. And my colleague here from Windermere High School, Terry Metz, in the front row guy. I didn't get an apple yet. I'd like maybe later, Terry, you could do that. But Mr. Lindeman was our English teacher. And he was also a prominent, he did all sorts of plays, all community plays, one-act plays, and I was an aspiring thespian as well as playing sports and doing a bunch of other stuff. But he had what was called scenes from Shakespeare. And it was a requirement for all us youngins to go through and do a scenes from Shakespeare. I had one of my friends, Mark Byzeski, and we chose a scene from Macbeth. And if you guys know Macbeth, it's not a rom-com. It's more of a tragedy. I chose to be Macduff. Macduff is the guy that survives. Macbeth is beheaded in this scene. And so what we were told, because there's a fiction and there's an illusion and how we're going to portray this to the school when we're doing this, there's a bunch of us, we only got 5 minutes to put this scene on. We got to wear robes and tights and all that kind of jazz. And then he gave us some swords that were made in Mr. Kelly's shop class. So they're not sharp, but they're made out of heavy gauge metal. And so Mr. Lindeman said, you need to create the illusion that these are so heavy and you need to go slow, otherwise you may hurt yourself or someone else. Okay, got it. And then he showed us how to do it, and then we practiced and everything. So the day of the event, we're there. We do a couple of our lines, and then we do the contact with the swords, and it's all cool. And then I get to my climax line. Get thee back. Mine soul is too much charged with thine blood already. So this is Macduff saying this to Macbeth, and I raise the sword up, one-handed instead of two-handed, which he told us to do, one-handed, and then it gets to the summit, and then I bring it crashing down. I kind of lost it a little bit. It was like my blood was too much charged with thine soul already. And so it comes down, it hits my buddy's sword, sparks all over the place, runs down, jumps over the guard, cuts into his knuckles. And so now he screams out an expletive and then drops the sword. And all of a sudden we know that, okay, the show is pretty much done here. So I start pushing him. I go, fall off the stage, because the whole thing is I have to cut his head off. And so we can't do that on stage. We had a plan for that. And I tripped him, and then he fell off. So he was far enough off the stage where I could simulate beheading him. And then I come out with a mannequin's head that's got blood dripping off it. And everybody's clapping, oh, blah, 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 this is great. The illusion was there. And then Mr. Lindeman grabbed us afterwards, and he chewed our butts out for not listening to how to properly handle the swords, because you almost lost the illusion. But you both get A's because it was probably the best scene from Shakespeare that I've ever had. So that's deception, whether it's really military deception or not. But when I go back to my military training, military deception is not a principle of war, but it's within surprise, which is a principle of war. The important thing is that you're able to get into your enemy's decision cycle and either surprise them with an illusion of something or a fiction that they want to have positive understanding of. It fits into their mindset of what is to happen. And so tonight's lecture is going to be about one of the more successful ones that occurred during World War II, that Allied command and soldiers, mainly Americans, I think in this story it's all Americans, get to do. And so by ways of introduction, I want to tell you about our author, Mr. Rick BEYER. I said he was a singer-songwriter. That actually is part of my deception. He's a best-selling author. He's an award-winning filmmaker and a lifetime history enthusiast. And his magnum opus was published in 2013, our book for tonight, Ghost Army of World War II, How One Top Secret Unit Deceived the Enemy with Inflatable Tanks, Sound Effects, and Other Audacious Fakery, is our topic for this evening. A few accolades, because he produced a documentary for PBS the same year, 2013. The Ghost Army was mesmerizing, entrancing, and oddly delightful. I like those accolades. That's great. And it earned him a Cine Golden Eagle, which is, I think, like a Tony or an Oscar. And so we're going to give it to you. It's a top tier. You've got something you have to dust every once in a while. I'm intrigued. So no further ado, for one of our most dapper, witty gentlemen, Mr. Rick BEYER, on his presentation tonight. Thank you, sir.
I like that Mark called me dapper and witty, so that's going to go on that's the blurb for the next book. Welcome, everybody. And this is, I think, your phone. Is this your phone? This is Don's phone. Let me check if I didn't want to, yeah. Okay, listen, 1944. You're a soldier, and you get your orders. You're headed to the front. But you're not going to be firing an M1 rifle or driving a Sherman tank. Your mission is to put on a show, for the enemy. You must stage a complex multimedia presentation spread out over many miles and do so right in the middle of a war zone, right on the firing line. It must be utterly convincing to an attentive and discerning audience that wants nothing more than to kill you, which I hope is not the mood of the audience tonight. Your life and thousands of other lives are riding on how good a job you do, and next week you're going to be asked to do it again. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a boring name for one of the most remarkable units in the history of warfare. And to carry out these deceptions, they used inflatable tanks, sound effects, radio trickery, and all sorts of illusion. And I first came across this story 20 years ago. It's kind of unbelievable. It was actually, the anniversary was in January. It was January 18th. It was the morning of January 18th, 2005. I got an email from my buddy about 8:30 in the morning. I was in my office. He said, hey, I met this woman named Martha Gavin, and her uncle, John Jarvie, served in this crazy World War II unit, and she thinks somebody should make a documentary about it, and would you be willing to meet with her? And in one of the more astute decisions of my life, I said yes, and I would meet with her. And I'll never forget, we were meeting in a coffee shop in Lexington, Massachusetts, where I lived at the time, and she walked in the door, and she's holding an armload of 3-ring binders, red 3-ring binders, and these were her uncle's wartime scrapbooks. He was one of the people in this unit who was an artist, which is part of the story, and we'll talk about that. And so it had his wartime sketches and paintings and photos in this scrapbook. So from the first day that I was involved in this story, I was literally touching history. And we were talking about this last night at dinner, that if you can touch history, and I'll give you a chance to do that later in the program tonight, you can be more connected with it. You can say, I actually touched this piece of history and how important that is. Well, look, I was astonished when I heard about this story. I had never heard about it. I thought I was pretty well read in World War II, but I didn't know anything about this. Now, I did know about the famous D-Day deception, Operation Fortitude. And I'm taking a chance here, but how many people came here tonight thinking you were going to hear about Operation Fortitude, the D-Day deception? And I do see some hands up there. Yeah, a fair number, okay? So bad news for you, you're not going to hear about it. Good news, this story is a better one, so it's okay. But this story, the Fortitude was a British-run deception designed to fool the Germans about where the D-Day landings would take place. This story is completely different. This is an all-American deception unit, 1,100 guys who are staging a traveling roadshow of deception going up and down the front lines, going into action after D-Day, and then being involved in the fighting in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany. And I was blown away by this story. Blown away, first of all, by the idea of weaponizing creativity to save lives on the battlefield. That seemed amazing. Blown away also that this unit could have a major impact on the war and somehow escape most of the history books until very recently. So this seemed like a gold mine as a filmmaker, and I dived in. It was the inspiration for my 20-year Ghost Army journey. I made the PBS documentary, The Ghost Army. I co-authored a book that is on sale here called The Ghost Army of World War II. And I have worked to see this unit honored the way that it should be, which I will talk about. And I've had a lot of success over the last 20 years as the Ghost Army guy, and I would like to say it's because I'm such a genius storyteller, and everything I touch turns to gold. Okay, not so much. Yeah, I'd like to say that, but it's not true. The truth is just that this is such an amazing story, and that I was able to learn about from the mouths of the guys who carried it out, and that I am honored to share with you. So let's dive into it, and let's start with their mission. Their mission was deception. Deception confuses the enemy. Deception can create surprise and give you the advantage. And these particular deceptions involved impersonation, impersonating other much larger American units to fool the Germans about the location and size of those units. Let me give you an example of that, and I'm going to warn our cameraman that I'm stepping away briefly from the podium. Let's imagine that all you guys over here are in the 75th Infantry Division. Congratulations. And you are going to be attacking the Germans over in this direction. And we don't want them to know about it. So we're going to take you guys over here on this side, and you are going to pretend to be all of them. And you are going to pretend that you're attacking the Germans in this direction and trying to get their attention. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, we think that the Germans, if we do this correctly, will move their troops from there over to here so that when you guys attack in this direction, you can do so with a greater chance of success and fewer casualties. And that is what deception is all about. And they did this not once and not twice, but 22 different times. This is the cover of the official history of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Note the classification markings, and it's been declassified. And around the edges of this unit are the insignia of every unit that they either impersonated or that they operated alongside of. And there's 36 units, if you're trying to count very quickly, around the cover. So they really got around. Now, how did they do it? How did they carry out this deception unit? Well, they went to war with three types of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. And they're probably best known for the visual deception, using inflatable dummies to fool enemy aerial reconnaissance. And this is one of them. This is one of the dummies that they used. This particular one is a replica of an M4 Sherman tank. Here's what one of the real ones looked like. This is a dummy M4 Sherman. They had hundreds of these. But not just the M4 Shermans. They had everything that an infantry division or an armored division would have on its equipment rolls. So they had, for example, artillery of every kind and description. They had trucks. This is a 2.5-ton truck. I should ask you guys a question. How much are you paying attention? How many trucks are in this picture? 3, yes, or none is another correct answer. But 3, because they're in the 2 of them are in the bags there. They had inflatable aircraft because armored and infantry divisions would be equipped with a couple of reconnaissance airplanes. They'd set up a phony runway and park a couple of inflated planes there to fool the Germans that way. Now, up close, of course, they look fake. It doesn't look like a real airplane, but this is a lot closer than we're going to let the German observers get. And so once you get a little bit farther away, it gets a little bit harder to tell which one is real. Which one is real? Left. Okay, so I think most of you probably got it. It's the one on the left. But this is still closer than we're going to let the Germans get. And if you have hundreds of these dummies, you can paint the landscape with a 3D masterpiece. This is a photograph from one of their deceptions along the Rhine River in 1945, their last deception. It was called Operation Viersen. Every vehicle in this photograph is inflated. Every one. And this photo holds a critical lesson for any of you planning a career in deception. What makes it look real? Right, the tank track. So it turns out that if you have a 40-ton Sherman tank, it leaves a deep impression in the ground. But if you've got a 90-pound dummy, not so much. So part of what they had to do is they had a combat engineering company. They were equipped with 3 bulldozers. And as the men are setting up and inflating these tanks at night, they are putting the tracks in with the bulldozers. And the lesson is that attention to detail is critical. If you miss one set of tracks out to one tank, and the Germans noticed that could totally mess up the entire deception. That would be the thread that unravels the sweater. Now, the soldiers who worked on this found it an incredibly memorable experience. And this is where we're going to find out if the sound is functioning on our show, because I want to let them tell you about it. Okay.
It was a little bundle of stuff, which a tank was in, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
Pulling this amorphic shape out of it, and then watching it being filled with air and taking form, like a monster.
If things went very well, there were air compressors. If things went not so well, there were bicycle pumps. And if things went terribly badly, there were our lungs.
In most cases, like a German tank, we could have it inflated and moved within 15 or 20 minutes.
The artillery piece was good. The Jeep was good. But that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work. It really was.
Now, many of the veterans who worked with these inflatables on the battlefields had a string of amazing stories. And one of my favorite was told to me by a veteran named Arthur Shilstone. And it was early on in the war. They were setting up the inflatables for one of the first times. And they would put a security perimeter around where they're setting them up so that no spying eyes get through. But somehow, a couple of Frenchmen on bicycles managed to get through this security perimeter, and now it's Arthur's job. He's on guard duty to shoo them away. And as he tells the story, he said, "They weren't looking at me. They were looking over my shoulder, and what they thought they saw was 4 GIs lifting a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. And they're looking at me," said Arthur, "and they're looking for answers, and finally I said, 'The Americans are very strong.'" Now, of course, for the Ghost Army, the inflatables are just one part of the deception triad that they go to war with. And the second type of deception that they relied on was sonic deception, using recorded sounds to fool the enemy. And this is brand new in World War II. And so what they did is they went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to the Army Proving Ground, and they recorded all sorts of sounds of tanks and trucks and men digging in, building pontoon bridges, not battle sounds, because that wouldn't be realistic, but all sorts of preparation sounds. And then they put them on, they recorded them onto glass transcription discs. And then they made a sound effects collection of records, and they brought them to the theater. But they didn't think that they could play them from records. They didn't think that would work. So what they did is they had a mixing truck, and they mixed the sounds together that they would want for a particular deception, and they would record it on a wire. And I don't know if if any of you are old enough, even our World War II veteran, well, he's probably old enough. But before the tape recorder, there was the wire recorder. And you would record, this is an actual piece of wire from a wire recorder. Maybe you can see the light glinting off it. It's about the consistency of fishing line. I'm holding out about 6 feet here. That's 1 second of sound. So it'd be about 2 miles on a reel of this. And it was enough for 30 minutes of sound. This was brand new, and it was really effective, and it's really kind of theater of the mind if you think about it. Imagine you're a German soldier, and you're observing from across the river, and you're listening in, and hour after hour, you hear the sounds of tanks rolling in. You hear the sounds of men digging in and setting up. You're going to believe that this stuff is actually happening, and you're going to be phoning back. You're going to probably imagine that you can see them because you hear it so well. There was a lieutenant for the sonic unit named Dick Syracuse, and he described himself as a kid from the Bronx. He was that kind of guy. And he told me that after a while, he began to see tanks. He knew they weren't real, but then he was thinking, well, maybe a real one has gotten in there. I think I see something. And he said it was psychologically unnerving. Although what he actually said to me was, it was psychologically unnerving. So, Dick Syracuse. Okay, so that's sonic deception. Very, very effective. And we have a lot of accounts from other American units who are next to the Ghost Army in the line that they are believing the sonic deception that they're putting out there. The third type of deception is radio deception. And this involves using radio signals to replicate the signals of a real unit. Let's see. Radio deception. There we go.
Radio was the stage setter. Now, when you think of the 23rd Special Troops, you think of the inflatable tank or the sound guys, and they're great. But they have to have a stage on which to perform. And we provided that stage.
That's Spike Berry. He was one of the radio deceivers. Radio doesn't get as much attention as some of the other forms of deception that the Ghost Army carried out because it's not as sexy as inflatable tanks or sonic deception, but it was one of the most effective tools that they had. And we now know, and they learned pretty much during and shortly after the war, that the Germans got a great deal of intelligence through radio traffic analysis. So the idea of radio deception is simple, right? If we have radios, the same number of radios that you'd have for battalions, regiments, divisional command, and they're all communicating to the Germans listening in, it's going to sound like there's a real division there. It's simple in concept, but it's complex in execution because they're sending Morse code, and German traffic intelligence was so sophisticated that they were able to identify the fist or sending style of individual American operators. So if you're going to convince them that you're really the operators of the 4th Division or the 2nd Armored Division, you're going to have to impersonate those operators. And there are some people like Malcolm Gladwell who will tell you this cannot be done. It's a unique sending style. Every person has their unique style. I'm here to tell you that the Ghost Army did it. They did it well enough to fool the Germans, which is what counted. This is one of the radio operators that we're seeing in the picture here. This is a man named Stanley Nance. And Stanley described what he would do when he was on a mission. He would go to the radio truck of the real operator, which is set up, it's in action, someplace, and it's a 3-step process. He would watch that radio operator, see where they paused, where they made mistakes, what they stumbled over, how fast they transmitted. Then after a while, that person would get up, and Stanley would just sit down at their radio truck, and he would start sending. And he's trying to mimic their style. Then after a while, that guy shuts his radio truck, goes on his way, wherever his division is going, and now Stanley fires up his radio truck, which he nicknamed Kilowatt Command, by the way. And now he's sending, and to the Germans, it just sounds like the same person is sending from the same spot, and now the deception is on, and now you can move the phony radio operators in the other direction and have the Germans not be any wiser. Stanley Nance was a guy I interviewed for my documentary film, and was in Las Vegas. It was in like 2006. And Stanley was a guy, he had a great sense of humor, but he had a kind of a flat affect about it. And we were talking before the interview. You know, you make conversation, and I said, "Do you have any children?" And Stanley said, "Yes, I have 7 sons." And I was like, "Wow, exactly, like that's cool." "Yes, and every one of them has 7 sisters." I said, "You have 14 children?" He said, "Yes, I do." I said, "How many grandchildren do you have?" He said, 54. I said, "How many, great-grandchildren do you have?" He said, 104. It's more now, it was 104 then. I said, "Can you name them?" He said, "I could, but I'd have to go in order." I said, "Okay, never mind, we're not going to do that." But this is Stanley Nance, and this is Stanley at the opening of the Ghost Army exhibit at the National World War II Museum in 2020, March of 2020, what a month, wearing his uniform from World War II, being wheeled around by one of those 104 great-grandchildren. And Stanley died 3 years ago at age 103, but what a great guy he was. Okay, so we got 3 types of deception. We're going to war. And on June 6, 1944, the Allies land on the beaches of Normandy. Within weeks, the Ghost Army, actually within 8 days, they start to carry off their first deception. Now, deception is as old as the Trojan horse, but the Ghost Army represented something unique. Let me see if I can capture it. They were the first mobile, multimedia, tactical deception unit in the history of war. You know, the Trojan horse, it worked great that first time. You never hear about the second time they used it. The Ghost Army was designed to be able to work time after time with the Germans never knowing about it. So it's a great idea. Whose idea was it? Well, it turns out it was born from a marriage of opposites. 2 officers, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And let me tell you about them. Ralph Ingersoll was a civilian drafted into the Army. He was a flamboyant, left-wing celebrity journalist and author. He was once described by the New York Times as a prodigiously energetic egotist. He was a genuinely creative thinker with a reputation for frequently embellishing the truth, which is a nice way to put it. A fellow officer once said, "I never met anyone who was such a bright guy who was such a goddamn liar." But wait a minute, what a great pedigree we have for a deception officer. He's smart, and he's a good liar, right? So by 1943, he's a staff officer for the U.S. Army working on deception plans in London. And his boss there is Billy Harris. And Billy Harris is the exact opposite person. He is a buttoned-up, straight-arrow, West Point military guy. His father was a general. His brother was a general. Billy will become a general after the war. This family is so embedded in the American military tradition that Billy Harris's mother introduced Dwight Eisenhower to Mamie Dowd. Okay? So under normal circumstances, these 2 guys might never even have had a cup of coffee. They might never have gotten together, but they are thrown together by war, and what a fantastic partnership it was. Ingersoll was the wild idea, pie in the sky, we can do this, we can do that guy. And Harris was the feet on the ground. Yeah, well, okay, great ideas, buddy, but how do we make this work within the Army as it exists? They were inspired by British tactical deceptions in North Africa and wanting to give the American Army every advantage they could. They dreamed up this idea. And I think this is a great example of the power of collaborating with someone who doesn't have the same mindset as you. And we're in a time now where things are extremely polarized and everybody points the finger across to the other side and calls them an enemy. But if you can work with somebody you disagree with, you can maybe ignite a spark, right? And sparks can power creativity. And to the credit of the U.S. Army, the top brass embraced this idea, eventually right up to Eisenhower. The idea was actually plotted out before Eisenhower is the ETO commander, but he embraces it immediately. Now, as I said, they went to war armed with 3 types of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. And once they're in action, they realize they are missing something. And it's not the brass that figures it out, it's the junior officers and the enlisted men. And it's a young lieutenant named Fred Fox who puts his finger on it. He says, we need to be more theatrical. And that leads to a 4th dimension of deception, which they call special effects. And it involves turning every one of them into actors.
Moving through the French villages so recently occupied by the Germans, they saw an opportunity to improvise yet another way to sell their deceptions, targeting enemy spies that might have stayed behind. They called it special effects.
Why don't we put a stencil of the name of the unit that we were simulating right on the trucks? And why don't we start a counterfeit shoulder patch factory where they would see we were the 75th Division, one of the divisions we did?
So we began to put on their patches and put their bumper markings on, and we physically assumed the role. Only for every 100 of them, there might be 10 of us.
My shirts were all wrecked from having sewn so many different shoulder patches on them.
They even set up phony command posts, and against all Army regulations, staffed them with counterfeit commanders.
If you're going to bring a division up, you better have a headquarters somewhere, and there better be a major general walking around. And so we had to have a fool general do this. Some sergeant would wear 2 stars for an operation.
Our job was to go in with our phony markings and phony stories that we were pretending to be officers and soldiers from another organization. And we were turned loose in town. Go to the pub, order some omelets, and talk loose.
A lot of the guys went to the bakery, got rolls and stuff, and said, we got to get an extra supply because we're moving out tonight, that kind of thing.
It was almost kind of silly, really. But I think what really confirmed the fact that there was effectiveness was sitting in a cafe and seeing a door open up gradually and somebody was taking pictures.
We'd find out if like a division or a special unit had a particular song that they liked to sing. We get blitzed and then sing their song.
They threw themselves into their work. Okay. So it occurs to me watching this that this is the point in the story that if I didn't have the video of the soldiers talking about it, you would not believe me. You would think, well, okay, that's some exaggerated thing, you're making this up. It can't really be true. And again, when I was early on working on the documentary film and trying to describe for people the story I wanted to tell, sometimes they would interrupt me and they said, wait a minute, is this fiction? I said, no, it's really happened. These guys really were involved with this. It's a crazy thing. One of the veterans mentioned in that video clip a counterfeit shoulder patch factory. And here are some of the fake patches that they made. They were made onto tent canvas, painted onto tent canvas using stencils. And these were saved by a veteran named Seymour Nussenbaum. And Seymour created 2 extraordinary scrapbooks. He's got one of them in front of them there that he eventually donated to our organization, the Ghost Army Legacy Project, and then we donated them to the National World War II Museum after conserving them. And he estimates that over the course of the war, they made 40,000 of these fake patches, both for operations that they conducted and for operations that didn't happen. And you might say, well, why didn't they just get real patches for these operations? And it's like, you're in the U.S. Army in a war zone in 1944, and you don't just pick up the phone and say, hi, can I have 700 2nd Division patches by Tuesday? It doesn't work that way. So they figured out pretty quickly that they had to make their own. Seymour lived to be 101 years old. I'm sad to say that he died this last year, just a few months ago, but he lived at home his whole life, right up to the very end. And so he had a great life, and it was a great pleasure to know him. Okay, so these 4 kinds of deception were used in concert to spin fake news to the enemy. And the unit carried out over the course of the war 22 different deceptions. In the interests of time, I'm not going to describe the 22 deceptions because I'll let you buy the book or watch the documentary film or Google it online. I'm sure you can find out that information. But this includes the clearing of Brittany. This includes Patton's race across France, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. There are Ghost Army deceptions associated with every one of those. And that last one, the crossing of the Rhine, was their biggest and best deception, up where Montgomery's 21st Army group was crossing, and the 9th Army under Montgomery was crossing the Rhine. The Ghost Army made it seem like the 2 9th Army divisions, the 30th and 79th, would be crossing 10 miles to the south of where they were really crossing. So it made it seem like they were crossing down here, when in fact the real crossing was up here. And that deception alone is believed to have saved thousands of lives. So that is a pretty amazing story of their success. Now, many of their operations were for George Patton's 3rd Army, and the 23rd did not work for Patton. They worked for his boss, Omar Bradley, but they carried out a lot of deceptions for the 3rd Army, and I don't think it's a coincidence. When we think of Patton, we think of his reputation. He's cantankerous, he's headstrong, he's difficult, he's got the ivory-handled pistols, he's shouting, he's cursing. Okay, that's what we see. Here's what the deception planners saw. Here's a quote from Billy Harris about General George Patton. He was the greatest team player that we ran into over there. He would do anything you asked him to in the interest of the overall picture. And I think that this is one of the keys to Patton's success, is that he embraces deception. And after the war, when they were post-morteming this stuff, the deception planners talked about the fact that there were some generals who did not embrace deception. But Patton wanted to win. He was ready to use every means at his disposal, and that included the Ghost Army. A top-secret report written years after the war categorized their exploits this way: rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. And then their story was hushed up for 50-plus years. So I believe these guys really are the unsung heroes of the war against Hitler and the Nazis. Now, there's a second part of this story that I want to make sure to take time to tell you about. When the U.S. Army created the 23rd in early 1944, it put pre-existing units together to handle the deception mission. And to handle visual deception, the Army picked the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. This was a unit loaded with artists. They had been recruited into this unit to work on camouflage. Now they're working on deception. And one of the soldiers in this unit, Harold Dahl, referred to the soldiers in this unit as the Art Boys. Probably about half of the 603rd were Art Boys. And these artists painted and sketched their way across Europe, using stolen moments of spare time to create a visual record of the war. This wasn't part of their mission. It's what they did in their off hours. And it began as soon as they arrived in Normandy.
A few miles from the Ghost Army's first bivouac was the Normandy village of Trevière. The artists were drawn to a bombed-out church off the town square.
These were some of the first sketches I did. They were not too long after the invasion, in the remains of this church. We might have had 3 or 4 guys in there sketching. We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
I was not the only soldier with a sketchbook. I'd have sketched whether I was the only soldier or not, but to be quite honest with you, I think it helped keep me in balance. I think it kept my sanity.
So I want to tell you a story about Trevière. In the ruins of this church, the soldiers encountered some of the children of the town, and so they painted them. Right? They painted some of the children, and this is a boy named Paul Grevet. He was painted by a soldier named John Hapgood. And I visited Trevière several times, and I had met the mayor of Trevière, interacted with them, and they introduced me to somebody in Paul Grevet's family who still lived in Trevière. And then eventually, on another visit back to Trevière, Paul Grevet came back to Trevière to meet us, to meet our group. And so we got to meet the boy in the painting. And by this time, we had already sent Paul Grevet, who lived in Brittany. He was an engineer for a car company. We'd already sent him a copy of this painting and framed it and presented it to him. So he wanted to present something to me when I met him in Trevière. And he doesn't speak English. He didn't speak English. He's passed away now. But he didn't speak English, but he said, he talked, and the owner of the B&B where we were staying translated, and he said, I'm a Norman guy, and we're in Normandy, and I want to present you a gift that comes all the way from the United States of America. I was like, okay. So I opened a box that he presents, and there's a little wooden stand about this big that he made by hand, and I put that down. And then I took out the rest of the present, and I brought it with me tonight to show you. And this is what Paul Grevet gave me. And I don't know if any of you can see it. I'm rotating it around, so maybe it catches the light for some of you. Anybody know what it is? Yeah, it's a piece of shrapnel. It's a piece of shrapnel most likely fired from the USS Texas on D-Day. Fired at that church in Trevière, and churches were reasonable targets because they were used by the enemy for reconnaissance and for snipers. Paul Grevet found this piece of shrapnel in the church a few days after D-Day, and he gave it to me. And he gave another one to my co-author, Elizabeth Sales. Now, I talked earlier about touching history and how amazing that is, and how often do you get to touch a piece of D-Day. Well, Mark, I'm going to hand this to you, and you can hand it, you can just pass it around. It's a pretty honest audience, right, Don? Wait a minute. So I'm hoping I get that back, and I'm hoping, Kent, if you're still here, please don't take it for the collections of the museum. It has a place in my office. So, but as you're looking at that, let me talk about some of the other artists who were in this unit who had quite striking post-war careers. There was a guy named Bill Blass that you may have heard of, who became a very well-known fashion designer in the 1990s, 80s and 90s especially. And can you see, that's Bill Blass is also drawing, when he's in Europe, he's drawing women's fashion. And he was a 21-year-old kid from Indiana with dreams of being a fashion designer. And this is the cover of his World War II notebook. I don't know if you can see, but in the upper left, he's drawn in pencil the mirror image bees, which become the logo of Bill Blass Fashion Design. So even as a kid fighting a war in Europe, he is thinking about his future. Then there was this guy, Ellsworth Kelly, and some of you may know of his work, very famous minimalist painter and sculptor with work. I'm sure he's got works at the Walker here in Minneapolis. I know he's got works all over the world, awarded many huge awards. He was in the Ghost Army. This is what his wartime work looked like, very different from his post-war work with solid colors. Arthur Singer, not somebody maybe that you've heard of, but he was a tremendously popular wildlife artist. Did the book Birds of North America, illustrated that. He and his son, Alan, his son Alan, did the Birds and Flowers of the 50 States postage stamp series back in the 1980s. So he was a tremendously talented artist. And I want to make mention of one more person who you might not have heard his name. And here he is. It says Ed Boccia up there, so that's a mistake. I've made a mistake in the slide. This man's name was Cleo Hovell. Cleo Hovell, and he was attending the Minneapolis College of Art and Design before he joined the Army and became part of the 603rd. And he was well known among the other soldiers in this unit for being a talented painter. This is, let's see, can I pull it up? This is one of his wartime works from a restaurant in Paris, I believe. So he was wounded in action, serving in the Ghost Army. He convalesced in Paris, where he studied with Pablo Picasso. He came back to Minneapolis, where he finished school, and he went to work for the Campbell Mithun Agency. I'm sure some of you have heard of that, before moving to Leo Burnett in Chicago. And he worked on some very famous advertising campaigns: Charlie the Tuna, the Jolly Green Giant, the Schlitz beer campaign. You know, when you're out of Schlitz, you're out of beer. But most important, and the reason I mention him, is what happened one day in 1952 at Freddy's Cafe on 605 2nd Avenue in Minneapolis. Hovell was meeting with an animator talking about adding an animal to an existing advertising campaign, and he sketched out that animal on a napkin. Does anybody know what that animal was? It was the Hamm's Beer Bear, yes. So I know it says Ed Boccia up there. That's a mistake. It's Cleo Hovell. But listen, when you next, I don't know why all these Ed Boccia slides are in here. I didn't take them out. That's a mistake. But when you next have a Hamm's Beer, think of the Ghost Army. So can you come up with a closer connection to Minneapolis than that? I don't think so. And I got today to go pose by the Hamm's Beer that's there in downtown St. Paul. So that photo will be going up on my Facebook tomorrow. So listen, I lead a Ghost Army tour. As was mentioned, I do a bunch of tours under the auspices of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. We've got another Ghost Army tour scheduled in the fall of 2025, this fall. We start in England. We visit Normandy, we go out to Brest where they were involved in a deception, and then we go all the way into Germany. It's a great trip, StephenAmbroseTours.com. If you want to come, we'd love to have you. One of the stops on this trip is the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. And 5,076 GIs are buried there under rows of gleaming white crosses. And up front is probably one of the most famous American soldiers of World War II. We've talked about him, General George Patton. And General Patton's grave is a tourist attraction. The buses come, and the people get out, and they go into the cemetery. They gather around Patton's grave, and the tour guide talks to them about General Patton. I have done it myself. Way in the back of the cemetery is another grave of another George, and hardly anybody visits this grave. This is George Pettle's grave. He was a radio operator in the 23rd one of the guys who sent phony radio messages designed to attract attention. And he did it all too well in Operation Bougainville in early March 1945, because just as they were finishing up the operation, the Germans opened fire with 88s, and the shells rained down on them. And George Peddle was hit with a piece of shrapnel, and maybe you have a different idea of what that means if you've held this piece of shrapnel in your hand that's passing around. And men went to help him, but he said, "Don't bother, I'm going to die," which he did. And this is, let's see, no, I've gone too fast forward, okay. I don't know what's going on in this show right now. So, but George Peddle was one of 3 Ghost Army soldiers killed, several dozen wounded in the course of the war. And his grave is a sobering reminder that although this story has its whimsical aspects, that men bled and died to carry out these deceptions. Now, 80 years after the war, the Ghost Army is slipping away. All the World War II soldiers are slipping away. To my knowledge, there are now just 5 men in this unit who served in the 23rd, just 5. So all too soon, the Ghost Army will be an army of ghosts, and I want to make sure that their story doesn't die with them. And that is why I made the documentary. That is why I co-authored the book with Elizabeth Sales. That is why I've started the Ghost Army Legacy Project, to preserve and honor the legacy of this unit. And we've done a bunch of things. We've gathered artifacts. We have set up a very content-rich website. We have helped to start the exhibit that the World War II Museum has done. But perhaps the most important initiative was seeking official recognition that was long denied because their story was kept secret for more than 50 years after the war. So in 2015, we launched a campaign to secure this unit a Congressional Gold Medal. And this is the highest honor that Congress can bestow. And it's been used to honor other military units who, for whatever reason, deserved recognition but didn't get it. And the Congressional Gold Medal is a very prestigious medal. The first one was awarded to George Washington in 1775 for the taking of Boston. So that's kind of sets the standard for that medal. And you guys know that getting a bill through Congress these days is difficult, right? I don't think that's any piece of news. But believe it or not, gold medal bills are even harder, because unlike all other legislation, a gold medal requires that 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate co-sponsor the bill, sign on to the bill as a co-sponsor before it can even be considered in committee. And so that meant we had to convince 67 senators and 290 representatives to co-sponsor the bill. But wait, there's more. Because if you try to get people to co-sponsor in a congressional sessions last 2 years. You get to the end of a session, and the next session begins, and you go back to 0. And by the way, you were involved in politics, Mark. You come back to that congressman 2 years later, they might have a different staff person who's never heard of you, and now you have to start explaining yourself all over again. So some people told us that it would be impossible to do this without the support of leadership, without the Pentagon, without celebrities, or without big money. Well, we proved them wrong. So it took us 7 years. But we lobbied on the Hill. It's a whole story. It would be a whole nother talk. I can come back and do that talk sometime. I just want to point out, this is a picture of some of our lobbying team. And there's 3 teenagers in this. And I think this is really amazing. You have the 2 young ladies on the left that are second and third from the left. Here, Reese Holmes and Madeline Christensen. You have Caleb Sinwell. I mean, Reese was 13. Madeline was 14 when she started lobbying. Caleb was 13 or 14. And they were amazingly successful. And they got a lot of the support. Caleb, especially in the Senate, helped us to get this over the line. So the president signed the legislation in February of 2022, and that was a great day. And it took 2 years for the U.S. Mint to custom design and mint the medal. But in March of last year, Congress officially presented the gold medal to the Ghost Army. So that's what the medal looks like. It's designed. I didn't bring the gold medal with me because I don't have it. But this is a bronze duplicate if you want to look at it. So we had this amazing ceremony in Congress. We had 600 people who gathered under the expansive dome of the U.S. Capitol for a ceremony that was hosted by Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. And this was a day I had worked towards for years, and now to see the leadership of the Congress and the military honoring these men who I had worked so long to honor, well, that was deeply, deeply moving to me.
We gather today to pay homage and to honor the legacy of a group of covert, creative, and courageous American war heroes who guarded truth and our precious troops with righteous deception.
When our troops were near, this group made the enemy believe they were far away, and when we were small, they made the enemy believe we were much larger.
A story of commitment and resolve, bravery and devotion, and remarkable talent and ingenuity.
These secret soldiers were innovators, and they played a decisive role in turning the tide and winning the war.
At great personal risk, these soldiers successfully diverted enemy resources and, as we have heard today, saved tens of thousands of American lives.
So my colleagues and I introduced the legislation to recognize and honor the Ghost Army with colleagues from both sides of the aisle and from both chambers. And that same bipartisanship is here today. It's no small feat to get all these congressional leaders in this room together, smiling and in agreement. It's like a political's Haley Comet. But the heroes of the Ghost Army and their families are used to defying their surroundings for the sake of making history.
John asked me how many veterans were there. There were 3 Ghost Army veterans at that ceremony out of the 5 who are still, out of the 6 who were alive at that time. I want to share one other picture from this day, and I took this picture in the holding room a few minutes before the ceremony began. And the 3 Ghost Army veterans, John Chrisman, Bernie Bluestein, and Seymour Nussenbaum, are seated in the chairs there. And kneeling on the ground and giving them their undivided attention are, from left to right, General Randy George, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the Secretary of the Army, Christine Wormuth, and next to her, General Randy George, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. And this person-to-person recognition of the soldiers, I think, for me, was the highlight of the day. The story of the Ghost Army is not trapped in the past, as I said when I spoke at the Capitol. You like the way I slipped that in, that I spoke there too? It remains an important inspiration for the Army today, and you can see that in this poignant moment. So this was a very meaningful moment for me. 500 years ago, the great political philosopher Machiavelli spoke these words: "Though fraud in all other actions is odious, yet in matters of war it is laudable and glorious." And the Ghost Army represents this powerful idea that you can harness creativity and illusion to affect the outcome of a war. The men who carried out these missions came from 46 states and many backgrounds. There were artists from New York City. There were truck drivers from Tennessee. For many, it was the first time they had ever been with people so different from themselves. One of the soldiers, Bill Blass, said you could hear Beethoven's Fifth at one end of the barracks and Pistol Packin' Mama at the other end. Despite their differences, they came together to create these astonishing deceptions, and then they went home and kept quiet about it for 50 years. And it's been one of the great honors of my life to meet the veterans of this unit. This is John Jarvie, whose niece, Martha, was the person who introduced me to the story. On the right here is Gil Seltzer, who he was 103 when this picture was taken and still driving. He lived to be 106, an awesome man. I'm here with On the left, Seymour Nussenbaum, who just passed away this year, who was at the gold medal ceremony. Bernie Bluestein, who's still alive in the middle, and Harold Flynn, who's passed away on the right. And these men have become my friends. And then I have watched them depart one by one until there are only a handful left. But I take heart in the fact that the work that I have done will help ensure that their story lives on. And it's been a labor of love, honestly, to do this, and it is to be here tonight to talk to you about it. The men of the Ghost Army were not textbook heroes, yet they served with ingenuity, courage, and honor. They put themselves in the line of fire, buying other soldiers time, a chance to fight and live. And veteran Stanley Nance summed it up this way. He said, if one mother or one new bride was spared the agony of putting a gold star in their front window, that's what the 23rd headquarters was all about. I think that's something Machiavelli would find laudable and glorious. I do, and I hope you do too. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you.
Get a high five.
All right, we're moving over. I'll take my medal with me.
Okay, it's the time you've all been waiting for. A couple of people have asked me, they've watched you walk around this place, and they're curious if you get your fashion sense from Bill Nye the Science Guy. How long have you been wearing bow ties?
I have pictures of me in bow ties at age 5, so I think I did not know about Bill Nye back then. But I did go through a period in my 20s and 30s when I succumbed to the tyranny of long ties. But eventually I found my way back to the chosen land here and have worn bow ties pretty steadily for the last 15 or 20 years. I do still have a few long ties in my closet, and the bow tie is almost always crooked, okay? That's how you know it's a real bow tie and not one that's a clip-on, you know? That's a mark of pride.
Well done, sir. Well done. We're ready for questions from the audience.
I was just wondering if the Ghost Army was developed like before World War II or during the war, and if it was ever used in like the Pacific Theater.
Where are you? I can't see you. Okay, very good question. So the Ghost Army was developed during World War II. It's amazing. The memo that goes out from the European Theater of Operations to the Pentagon asking for the unit to be formulated goes out on Christmas Eve, 1943. Christmas Eve, 1943. So 2 weeks later, the unit is stood up at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and 3 months after that, they are off to Europe. That is how fast it happens. And they don't know. I just recently came across some video of the operations officer of this unit talking about it, Colonel Clifford Simonson, talking about it in 1996. He said, we did not know how to do this mission. We just had to figure it out, you know, because we didn't have any manuals. There wasn't any history of deception in the U.S. Army. And so they went and they figured it out. And I do think that's one of the remarkable things about the story. They did not go to the Pacific. They were scheduled to go to the Pacific to be part of the invasion of Japan. And you can imagine how excited all these soldiers were to make that journey. And then we dropped the atomic bomb, and suddenly they didn't need to go to Japan, and that was even more exciting. There was deception, some deception that goes on in the Pacific Theater. I haven't studied it, don't know much about it, but it is very, very little, and really none by the Army, because, of course, they're mostly attacking beachheads, and there's not much they can do with deception in that.
Maybe you could follow up a little bit what happened with Mr. Ingersoll after the war.
You know, nobody has ever asked me that before. But,
seriously?
Yeah,
oh,
no.
Wow, okay.
So Ralph Ingersoll, as I mentioned before, he was an author and a publisher of a newspaper called PM in New York City, which went through some terrible difficulties once he left and when he was away during the war, and it eventually folded after he got back. He wrote some books. He wrote a best-selling book, sort of about the war, not mentioning anything about the 23rd or deception or his involvement in that. He then went on to own a series of small newspapers, and I think he died. He tried to write his memoirs. I've read the drafts of his memoirs that are in his files, but he never got them published. So, and I think he died in the 70s, yeah.
So fascinating character.
Yeah, he's an amazing character, and he was really famous in 1942. He was very, very well known and very controversial. He was a guy who had a big mouth and a big ego, and got himself into trouble occasionally.
The way we like it. Makes good history. Okay, who's got the next question? Over here, Andrew.
Is this on? Okay, are there any modern PSYOPs units that are direct descendants of the 23rd, or did they write the manual for it in the 50s and 60s and on? Second question, how'd you get a piece of shrapnel through TSA?
The first question is that the PSYOP soldiers today consider themselves the inheritors of the Ghost Army legacy. I've been down to, believe it was just renamed Fort Bragg today. I've been down to Fort Bragg a bunch of times and done stuff with them. I don't know everything that they do regarding deception because it turns out it's secret. But they consider themselves the inheritors of that mission, and they would love to be officially by the U.S. Army considered to have the 23rd be part of their unit lineage. It is not officially at the moment. In terms of going through TSA with the shrapnel, let me tell you, the first story was coming back from France with it, when I was very nervous about it because I didn't want to put it in my suitcase and have people looking at it when I wasn't there to explain, so I carried it with me. And at this time, when you were going through customs in France, they would have people wander up to you at the airport, security people, and just ask you questions casually. And a woman came up to us and she said, do you have anything, she asked us some other questions, do you have anything that was a gift to you from someone? And I said, yes. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, it's a piece of shrapnel from World War II, which might not have been the smartest answer. I mean, sculpture probably would have been smarter.
Deception.
But I'm not good at deception. That's why I like it so much. And then she said, well, do you trust the person who gave it to you? And I said, yes. And she said, okay, you're fine. And I have probably flown with it 50, 75 times. And what I have learned in doing that is that the key to not slowing myself down is to take it out before I put the bag in. If they just look at it, it's just a hunk of metal and they don't really care about it. If they see it in the bag, they don't know what it is and they want to dig in and they don't want me to touch it while they're digging in, and that's what takes forever. So stories, Ghost Army shrapnel stories, right?
Very good. Explosively exciting.
Very good. I have a German grenade case too that I have traveled with, and that, again, I thought I was very nervous about it, but that one you just pass right through the scanner and it's no problem at all. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Andrew, I'll let you know that I actually commanded one of these PSYOP battalions here in the Twin Cities. Maybe we'll talk about that with a beer sometime. Rick, several years ago, we had the curator of the Army Art Collection. I should probably invite her back. But my question is, all the artwork that you showed in your slides, where does that exist? Is that now part of the Army Art Collection that is now at the Army Museum at Fort Belvoir, or is it part of your Ghost Army exhibits?
So let me first of all say that the Army art curator is Sarah Forgy, whose name is an anagram for has a forgery. Which, and she's kind of a cool customer. It took me years to get up the nerve to tell her that. And then she said that nobody else had ever told her that. So I thought that was pretty amazing.
That's a good story.
Yeah, so the art comes from all over the place. Most of it is still held by families of the soldiers in the unit. Some of it is in different collections. The World War II Museum has some, which I've given them. No, I'm talking about the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They have some of them. The U.S. Army has a few, but less than 25 or 30. The Smithsonian just got a big donation of artworks from Arthur Singer, the wildlife artist. He had more than 200 watercolors painted during the war that his family donated to the museum at Fort Belvoir. To the Smithsonian. There's an art collection at Brown University called the Anne S.K. Brown Collection. They hold some Ghost Army paintings. I am generally trying to get people to either give them to the Army Museum or to the National World War II Museum, but I don't mind if they donate them to other museums because it spreads the story out to different places and makes sure it'll be remembered by different people.
Good, okay.
If you can get the Hams Beer Bear as a speaker at one of the future roundtables, that might be good.
Have there ever been any signs the Germans ever detected or even suspected any of the deception this group was a part of?
I have never found any, and we've tried to do some research, and honestly, there could be more research done in this area. It'd be great to know. There certainly are deceptions that they didn't really buy, that they kind of like went, well, I don't know, that's not, we've got other information, we're going to go with that. But I've never seen anything that suggested that they cottoned on to the idea that there was a deception unit operating against them.
I'm curious here. What happened to all of this inflatable trucks and all of this stuff that they had created? I know we had done a program on the gliders, and the gliders were just sold off to civilians and turned into civilian cabins and things like that. So what happened to all that?
So Seymour Nussenbaum has photos in his scrapbook of the day they burned all of their inflatables before they came back to the U.S. because they were going to be re-equipped with new inflatables, which they didn't need and didn't happen. So what happened to the new inflatables? I have heard a story that a bunch of those were sold to Israel in 1947 or 49 or something like that. I've never been able to confirm that story. I have looked and talked to people to see if anything might have been left behind, might be in a warehouse someplace. The general belief is that the material that these were made out of would not have lasted, and so even if you found a box that said inflatable tank from 1944, it would be just a bunch of rubber and canvas inside there. What I do believe must exist someplace, and it could just be hopeful thinking on my part, is the sound effects collection that they used, because there were multiple copies made out of it, because I haven't even talked tonight that there was another deception unit involved in Italy, much smaller, and they were only involved in 2 operations, but they used sonic deception also. So there's at least 2 sets of these sound effects records, plus the original glass transcription discs. These are all things that should last for a long time. So either there's a collection of them, and the Library of Congress and the National Archives say, we don't have it. There's a collection of them someplace, or some officer took some home, and somebody's got them in a personal collection. And I'm always putting the word out and asking and trying to find that. But I haven't come across any of it yet.
We've got somebody back up on the right.
Do you have any idea how they were able to keep the secret for so long when we didn't have the Official Secrets Act like the Brits had? Was just an order given, be quiet and go home, or not?
So they kept the secret by not telling anybody. Okay, this is a great question, and it comes up a lot. And secrecy is a really complicated issue with this story, because if you were to go into the New York Times website and Google Ghost Army, you would find a headline and a story about this unit from November 1945. So the official history was classified, and the story was classified. But what happened in 1945 is that one soldier talked about it. And he was a soldier named Sebastian Messina from Woonsocket, Rhode Island. No, from Worcester, Massachusetts. Worcester. And he went home and he talked about this to a reporter, and the reporter wrote a story about it and submitted it to the paper, and the paper submitted it to the censor, and the censor said, "You can't publish that because that's top secret." And then the war ended, and then the censorship office closed, and the newspaper said, "Guess we can publish it now." And so they put it as a big front page story, and then it spread around to other news media. But I think the Pentagon did a good job of kind of hushing that up so by 1946, then there really isn't much happening about it in the media. You get occasional little mentions of it, but really very, very little. The official history is classified. Fred Fox, who wrote the official history and who went to work in Eisenhower's White House, tried to get it declassified. He couldn't get it declassified, so there was a real interest in keeping this secret. They told many of the soldiers not to talk about it, and I think a lot of the soldiers took that very seriously. I mean, they'd been involved in a big effing war, and they were loyal to their country, and they wanted to keep that secret. And I think there were other soldiers, and I seriously was told this by soldiers who were literally embarrassed that this is what they did in the war. I'm supposed to tell, you were a tank battalion commander, you did this and you did that, and I'm supposed to say, "Oh yeah, I blew up inflatable tanks on the battlefield." They didn't want it. There was a guy who joined his VFW and then he unjoined because he said they all had war stories, and I just couldn't. I didn't think I could tell any of my war stories. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer to your question, but that's the best of what I've got.
Okay. We have any other? Okay, go ahead.
There's always one more to keep you here longer and longer.
Not a question, just a comment. I served in the Army from 73 to 77. My duty station was at the Port of New Orleans, sending stuff overseas. And because we had such a small command, we did not have housing or a mess at all. We just lived on the civilian market. I rented a house from a fellow who was a gunner on the USS Texas. So I wonder if he handled that shell that you found.
Wouldn't that be funny, right? And I haven't, my suspicion is that it's from the Texas because of the size of the shell, suggests it's a battleship shell. And maybe, Brooks can look at that and give me an expert opinion. But I haven't actually gone back and looked at the Navy records, the ship records, to see if there is, information specifically on the targeting of it. So if I get another 20 years on the Ghost Army story, I might get to that.
Okay, any other questions out there? Okay, this is the time where we make some announcements and invite you next month, March 11th, for Major General Peggy Etter and When Girls Step Out. Correct? Got that correct, sir? Eater. Okay, fantastic. We're going to take a couple of photos up front, so anybody that wants to purchase a book, please go up to the rotunda, and we will. We're going to take a couple of photos down here before we go, sir.
And I just want to say, I did sign all the books, but I'm happy to inscribe them to you and personalize them if you want that, and I'm happy to do that once I get up there.
Yep. I want to thank Mr. Chris Bellin for his work setting this up tonight, as well as the Johnson JR2C that has done our color guard for the past year plus. Thank you all. I'd like to ask Director Whitworth and General Nash, as well as Captain Berg, to come down front with Mr. Patton. We'll get a couple of photos. And safe travels tonight, and thank you again.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.